All right, folks. So welcome to the Data Science Seminar from the University of Washington's eScience Institute. As part of the University of Washington, I want to begin by acknowledging the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. As we begin, for the in-person people, please turn off your ringer. And we have a microphone in the room, so when it comes to questions, we will try to get you to come down to the microphone, or worse, you'll have to ask me the question, and then I'll repeat it, and I'll likely get it wrong. If you're joining us via Zoom, there's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and we'll use that feature. Type in your questions. Due to the hybrid nature of this talk, I'm going to ask that we hold all questions to the end. I mean, you can use the Q&A feature anytime you want, but we'll do the question and answer period at the end. Our speakers today are Professor Katie Shilton and fellow Emanuel Moss. Professor Shilton is at the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland College Park. Her research explores the ethics and policy for the design of information technologies. She is the PI of the PERVADE project, which we'll hear more about today, I believe. And she holds a PhD in information studies from UCLA. Emanuel Moss is a joint postdoctoral fellow at Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative and Data and Society's Research Institute's AI on the group initiative. His work focuses on issues of fairness, accountability, ethics, and governance for AI systems. Emanuel has a PhD in anthropology from SUNY. And with that, CUNY. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Emanuel and Katie.
Thank you for that introduction. We're really pleased to be here today. So today we're going to be focusing on problems of trustworthiness in social data science. So scholarship that relies on the rich data and information generated about people through digital interaction. Next slide. So we're going to start by talking about what we mean by social data science and why we think there are trust problems in this area. And then we'll talk a bit about why existing research ethics guidance traditionally provided for data about people, things like the Belmont Report and the US Common Rule, aren't a great fit for guiding data science. Then we'll talk about another discipline that has struggled with a similar mismatch with existing ethics guidance, ethnography. And we'll talk about the parallels between ethnography and social data science, parallels that we think have a lot to do with this mismatch to the common rule. Then we'll talk about how these parallels can help us think through new approaches for trustworthy data science based on excavating two things that are too often paved over in data science: participant awareness and power relationships. Next slide. So I probably don't need to tell this group this, but digital data has become a gold mine for what's being referred to as computational social science or social data science, using digital data to understand people. But new data collection methods have also raised new questions about ethics and participation in this sort of research. So you might remember the furor set off by Facebook's 2014 emotional contagion study with Cornell University researchers. An analysis by my colleague Casey Fiesler and co-authors examined the backlash to that research using public comments on media articles about the study. These revealed pretty fundamental disagreements about what Facebook is and what a user's relationship to it should be. In particular, Facebook users objected to the feeling of living in a lab, being observed for a study while online. And mistrust of research uses of online data is broader than Facebook. A survey of Twitter users by Fiesler and Preferis found that a majority of users were surprised that tweets are used in research and feel informed consent should be necessary. This is surprising for many social data science researchers because Twitter is sort of the model organism for online interaction. It's studied a lot. But respondents expressed a willingness to participate in research, but it depended on the purpose of that research, the team and institution doing the research, and the mechanics of how that data would be collected and processed. And we're even seeing a backlash to digital data collection in research that does use traditional informed consent. A recent survey of habitual survey takers indicated that only 33% were willing to participate in pervasive data gathering. So these are folks who regularly take surveys for academic purposes, but they didn't like the idea of sharing their cell phone data in particular. The study was conducted in Germany, so this may be a particularly privacy sensitive population, but I still think it's worth noting that even these folks who regularly participate in survey research were really unhappy about the idea of letting researchers have data from their phones. And finally, a number of studies indicate that, including a Pew study, indicate that trust issues in pervasive data research may be even larger within marginalized communities for pretty good reason. Importantly, this research backlash is occurring at the same time as a more general backlash against the platforms that create the data at the heart of social data science. There are now regular headlines, podcast episodes, a major motion picture, or really just a Netflix documentary about what are increasingly viewed as the ethical failings of big tech. The tech industry broadly has struggled with whether and how to talk about its politics, its values, its social obligations, and its role in controlling increasingly pervasive data about all of us. So what should social data science researchers do in the face of this kind of mistrust and uncertainty? With colleagues, Manny and I have been part of the PERVADE project, which has been a 4-year grant-funded project, it's NSF funded, to study empirical questions in data ethics. And at the heart of our project has been the question of trust in social data research and the willingness to participate in social data research. And what we saw when we started looking into ethics in data science was that most of the existing solutions, at least 4 years ago, on the table were reliant on approaches that had already been developed for doing research ethics, but weren't appropriate for the emerging paradigm of doing research with big social data, digital data sets. And so Manny's going to talk a bit about why that is.
Thanks, Katie. So when we think about research, it's common for us to think about how scientific knowledge is produced through the conduct of experiments. You have a hypothesis, you design an experiment to test it, and that experiment disproves your hypothesis, or your hypothesis stands up to the experiment and becomes a more firm piece of knowledge. Experiments have been incredibly important, not only in physics experiments like the one on the slide here, but also in developing life-saving medical interventions like vaccines, surgeries, drug therapies, transplants. The list could go on. But involving patients in medical experiments, in research projects, and research experiments involves them in some degree of risk. In unproven experimental drug or surgery may cause harm to individual research subjects. It doesn't always go right the first time, even if that experimental process eventually leads to treatments that can improve the lives of hundreds or thousands or even millions of people. Throughout the middle of the 20th century and earlier, this trade-off provided a perverse rationale that researchers used to justify experiments that wound up killing or maiming research subjects, some of whom were powerless to refuse involvement in the experiment, as with the infamous experiments conducted by Joseph Mengele in Nazi concentration camps, or these experiments deceived participants about the risk they were exposing themselves to by participating, as we saw with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where a widely available treatment for syphilis was withheld from research subjects drawn from majority African-American county in Alabama, I believe. Yeah, Alabama. The idea that conducting medical research could hurt patients is in direct conflict with the Hippocratic oath that doctors have taken for centuries, the one we're all familiar with, to first do no harm. And yet, medical research also has the potential to save thousands of lives, which puts biomedical researchers in a bind. As physicians/researchers, they have dual conflicting duties. As a researcher, their duty is to contribute to general knowledge about humanity, medicine, surgeries, cures for illnesses. But as medical doctors, as physicians, their duty is to provide the best possible care to the individual patient in front of them, the person who is suffering from this or who is possibly volunteering for an experiment. So largely as a result of public horror in reaction to the kinds of experiments I was just talking about, Nazi concentration camp experiments, the Tuskegee experiment, and a few others, a bunch of bioethicists got together to develop a set of principles for conducting biomedical research that addressed these controversies and attempted to resolve this bind I'm describing that medical researchers inevitably found themselves in. These bioethicists wrote a report called the Belmont Report that outlined a set of principles, creatively called the Belmont Principles, that were intended to help resolve this tension and wound up being the foundation for the common rule that guides biomedical research in the United States today. These principles were respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Respect for persons called for informed consent. People should know that they're in an experiment and should be free to opt out of it. They shouldn't be coerced. Respect for persons also includes respect for privacy. The fact that someone is in an experiment shouldn't be disclosed or used against them. And respect for persons also includes attention to autonomy. People should be free to opt out. They should have control over their bodies and what's done with and to them. But the Belmont Report called for special care to be taken for those with less autonomy who still might be necessarily involved in medical research practices. Children, elderly, coma patients, differently abled folks, and so on. Beneficence refers to the balancing of harms with benefits. Research experiments should opt for the least risky interventions possible to prove the theory of the case. These experiments should look for already available data that can be obtained or repurposed without subjecting more people to harm. Risks to patients should be balanced with potential benefits. It might not be worth exposing people to a great degree of risk for, say, a cure for baldness, but for something that prevents a threat of death to a great many people, maybe higher risk experiments are worth considering. And also, patients should be monitored to make sure that risks don't wind up exceeding the expectations, to make sure this beneficence, this balance between upsides and downsides remains on the right side of the ledger. Justice refers to the risks and rewards of research being distributed equitably. Poor people shouldn't be subjected to experiments to provide cures only rich people can afford, for example. And justice also refers to the idea that research subjects shouldn't be drawn from already vulnerable populations, as we saw with the Tuskegee experiment. Now, these principles are all well and good as far as they go. And because they were designed for biomedical research, they work particularly well for that. But what we want to talk about today and what we've uncovered through our empirical research with PERVADE is that data research is a bit different from medical research, mainly because the trade-offs between risk and harm are quite different. What do I mean by this? The human subjects research paradigm conceptualizes risks, harms, and benefits in very specific ways. The risk of harm accrues to individual research subjects. They're the ones taking an experimental drug who might experience the side effect or an adverse effect from a surgery. Their privacy, the participants in the study, their privacy is at risk of being revealed. Their participation in the study is at risk of being revealed if there are insufficient attention to privacies. And this is particularly grievous if it's revealed that you suffered from a certain stigmatized condition that was the subject of the experimental research, as was the case with early HIV research in particular. Meanwhile, in this paradigm, the benefits of this research accrue to society. We all benefit from any new drug that comes out of this research without having to put our own well-being at risk by participating in a drug trial. There's a gap, though, between risks, harms, and benefits for human subjects in biomedical research and for data research subjects. Data research projects collect data from platforms that are in widespread use. Government services database, census, but many other databases kept by governments. Services like Netflix that collect data and then make that data available for research projects. Facebook makes data available for research as well. And many other platforms make data available for research. For these projects, the benefits accrue to the individual who is using that service, who is who is embedded within that database. They get to use the digital platform that's being used to collect pervasive data. A good example of this is the My Digital Life app that was at the center of the Cambridge Analytica controversy. People derived a benefit from playing around with that app. but that created a risk for all of society. The entire Cambridge Analytica project wound up creating risks for democracy around the world. These risks are societal. If a data research project learns something about a category of people from a small study, say, it can extrapolate out and make decisions that affect all members of that category. The harms are pervasive. They involve people outside of the scope of the experiment, and they are persistent. Data can be repurposed for other research projects because they are often exempted from institutional review on account of the fact that they use already collected data. They don't need a separate research protocol in order to repurpose that data, as you would need with biomedical research. So the standard toolkit for making decisions about biomedical research, making people fill out informed consent forms, locking the clinical files in a safe, and so on, don't quite work for data research. It's pretty obvious to us that even today, a new toolkit is needed. So, like I've said, data research and biomedical research are different. That makes it difficult to apply the recommendations of the Belmont report through the common rule to data research. And yet, when Katie and I started thinking together about this uneasy fit, we immediately started thinking about a similar difficulty that our disciplinary practices around ethnography had without also onboarding the recommendations of Belmont. I'm going to turn it over to Katie to talk through how some of the lessons from anthropology and other ethnographic disciplines are informing the work we can do around trustworthiness in data research.
Okay, so for those of you outside of the social sciences, ethnography is a practice that was developed within anthropology. It's frequently used within sociology, and it's actually used in a huge range of human sciences disciplines now and social sciences. And it involves observation, essentially, and unobtrusive, although the level of unobtrusiveness is up for debate, but observation of people. And social data research has more in common with this qualitative practice than is immediately obvious. So the instruments are obviously really different. Ethnographers use human senses, they take notes in notebooks, maybe they type notes if they're in a place where they can do that. And so, human sensors are substituted for digital sensors. But individual sense making is the major tool of ethnography rather than algorithmic pattern matching. But both forms of research rely on integration and interpretation of multiple data streams. And both require judgment about what features of a context are relevant for meaning making. The ethical challenges resonate between these methods as well. In a classic ethnographic textbook written in the 80s, Spradley writes, and I have this quote up for you, "No matter how unobtrusive, ethnographic research always pries into the lives of informants. Participant observation represents a powerful tool for invading other people's way of life. It reveals information that can be used to affirm their rights, interests, and sensitivities, or to violate them. Substitute the word social data, and the concern is the same. Reflecting first and foremost on whether data use will affirm the rights, interests, and sensitivities of the people it documents, or alternatively, violate those interests, should be a first order concern for trustworthy social data research." Ethnographers' dedication to the rights and interests of the subjects of participant observation comes from a long and painful history within their own discipline, and specifically of the use of ethnographic methods. The history of ethnographic research is also one of colonialism. The earliest ethnographies were conducted by American and European academics through fieldwork among indigenous peoples, and this practice continued well into the 1980s. As post-colonial movements took hold in academia, and particularly in anthropology, scholars began to grapple with the ethics of their work, and a recentering of the rights of and obligations to research subjects was the result of a field-wide reckoning. Today, ethnographers are expected to reflect on their power as researchers in their publications and before they even go into the field, as well as on what they are taking from the communities they study. Ethical concerns in early ethnographies were not limited to colonialism, but also extended to other historically disenfranchised groups. One of the most famous examples of controversy over ethical issues in ethnography surrounded Loud Humphrey's 1968 dissertation and his later book, Tea Room Trade: Impersonal Sex in Public Places. In this study, Humphreys conducted observations of male-male sexual encounters in public restrooms, known as tea rooms. Humphreys disguised his identity and purpose as a researcher, did not obtain consent from his participants, and used license plate numbers to discover the identities of the otherwise anonymous men from the restrooms. The ethics of tea room trade caused an uproar at the time and are still debated within sociology. So ethnographers' reflection on awareness of their research subjects and their power relationships with research sites, I think, are pretty inspiring when we start to think through social data science. Along with the PERVADE research team, Manny and I have argued in a recent paper that data scientists should probe appropriateness and complex potential harms of their work using two lenses that are directly inspired by ethnography. First, data scientists can learn from ethnographers' contextual sensitivity and experience helping research subjects interpret research participation by reflecting on awareness. Ethnographers have developed a suite of techniques over time to gain the trust of participants. First, ethnographers must gain what they call entree. It's the permission of participants to be in their space and in their lives. Ethnographers frequently encourage research participants to read parts or all of their analysis using techniques like participant checking to check the validity of their observations and findings. Some ethnographic traditions move beyond entree and participant checking to something called collaborative ethnography, which involves people in the creation of research goals, data collection, analysis, authorship, and dissemination. Data scientists can also learn from ethnographers' reflections on power. Over time, ethnographers have recognized how their field served colonial power, made efforts to diversify the discipline, and shifted topics of study by including studying up, performing ethnographic research on groups more or at least equally rather than less powerful than the researcher. And Matt is going to talk a bit more about what reflections on awareness and power might look like for data science.
Thanks, Katie. So to think about what awareness and power looks like in social data research, we've found it helpful to start from the data itself by mapping social data to two spectra. So what you see here is a heuristic for thinking about where data come from that can help us reason about what people's reasonable expectations are about what will be done with data that pertains to them. So this is where we're going to start our analysis. People's data social data gets collected somewhere along this continuum left to right on the screen of private to public. Private data might get collected with an explicit or implicit expectation of privacy, especially for things like medical records or financial documents. And yet this private information might wind up in data sets used for one research purpose or another. Public information gets collected for research too. Twitter feeds, public information, Twitter feeds, census data, likes on YouTube videos. These are all public data that can be scraped. It's out there. It can be found. It's not behind lock and key or behind a password. These are all public data that can get incorporated into social data research. The other continuum here is top to bottom to top on the screen about the intentionality with which data is created. When I press send on a tweet, I know that I'm intending to put something brilliant or hilarious out there into the world, just as I know when I'm liking a video or filling out a census form that I'm producing a data point as I'm doing so. But I might not be as aware that I'm also contributing information to data sets unintentionally all the time. I don't necessarily intend to create a log of my location every time I open up a Google product on my phone. Nevertheless, I do. And I would actually have to take some pretty deliberate steps in my deep down in my settings to get my phone to avoid doing so. I also don't know if or when my keystrokes are automatically logged on a web form or that my IP address is being logged when I watch Netflix. I mean, I know because I study these things, but not everybody knows that their IP address is being logged when they watch Netflix. And this is nevertheless being automatically collected. So most data fall somewhere on this chart that I'm showing. These are the kind of 4 quadrants of the previous unrolled, so we can give some examples of them. So broadcast data are public data that were intended to be so by the person that they pertain to. I know when I'm tweeting and I want it to be public to other people. But there's always shades of gray across these buckets. I might post something to Facebook and think that it's only going to be shared to my close contacts, for example, and might be surprised if it showed up in somebody else's research findings. Secrets are private, but I know that I'm sharing them and usually have a pretty firm set of expectations about the circumstances under which they'll be kept secret. When I tell my doctor something, they might enter it into a health record, but I know that record is supposed to be kept confidential by my doctor. And I might be surprised to learn that it was part of medical research collected from my electronic health record. Exhaust data is available and accessible, but it is generated without me necessarily taking some action or volunteering it or being intentional about it. Traffic data that includes a count of my car going down the road, CCTV camera footage that shows me walking through a stairwell or down a street, a satellite photo of my house. All these are exhaust data. The espionage data refers to data that I had not expected to be being collected without my knowledge. This would include things like telemetry data from my phone being collected without my awareness by a private company like Android, even though they made my phone and own it and operate it, own the IP behind the phone and operate it. Or it could also pertain to a piece of malware that was surreptitiously installed on my phone, collecting keystroke data from my private text messages. Like I said, there are shades of gray for all of this, but thinking about where data came from, which of these buckets in our heuristic came from, can serve as a starting point for thinking about the ethical implications of data research. And I should point out, just because data comes from one box doesn't make it completely ethical to use or completely unethical to use if it comes from another box. Like, not all espionage is unethical because it comes from that box, and not all broadcasts are ethical to use just because it comes from that box. But the points we can think about from this, from an awareness of where data comes from, the first of which has to do with informed consent. Just because something was posted intentionally, it doesn't mean that the person who posted it consented for it to be used for a research project. We can ask how the terms of service or other agreements users might have made affect whether it's permissible to use that data for a research project. But we can also ask what objections people might have for their data being used in a project, and whether or not it's feasible to obtain their consent as part of that research project. And if we ask them for that consent, whether or not it's feasible for them to refuse. Is there a power imbalance at play that would make them feel coerced into agreeing? Maybe because they want to continue accessing a service that they become reliant on, or because we showed up from a powerful research university asking for this. Similarly, public data can have implications for privacy. While someone might have shared, for example, their mental health status on Twitter, where they're part of a community of people who follow each other and have norms around how they communicate and how they share information about someone else, having that mental health status documented that they themselves documented in a tweet shared in a research paper might be a totally different matter for their privacy and for how they feel about that piece of information about themselves. And even if data is delinked from a personal identity, it can still be used to re-identify people and reveal things about them that they might not want shared. So this kind of has to do with a lot of the exhaust data that we're talking about. It's not mere exhaust. It's not completely delinked from its source. There was a very in-depth New York Times article about a year and a half ago that showed how geolocation data can be used totally disconnected from identity. These are just dots on a map from a phone pinging a cell phone tower, but these dots can be connected one to the based on the device ID and follow someone all the way home from a public event, like a protest, to their house. Similarly, data that has been purposely anonymized to hide who it is connected to can be de-anonymized, as numerous studies have shown. One of the PIs on the PERVADE project has shown how just a couple of data points could be used to link the Netflix prize data to very identifiable public individuals. So thinking about data sources can also help think about the principle of justice. Where does the data come from? Does it come from a particularly vulnerable population? Is it more or less likely to produce errors when it is applied to a population that has historically been harmed by such errors? Did that population have an understanding of the relationship between the data they were producing and the research that was being incorporated into, and were they able to give consent to it? Was a vulnerable population being researched? Were facts being revealed about them to benefit a less vulnerable population? Does a research design include members of the population group it is targeted at helping? If a research project involves people who are suffering from a particular ailment, are they involved in the research design? For example, drawing a link back to biomedical research. Particularly in the US, but also in non-US contexts, data-driven technical developments have been designed for the targeted oppression of minorities and have failed to live up to their liberatory promises. Are a wide range of stakeholders being incorporated into the research design? So we think that pervasive data researchers also need to consider power relations and representational justice as an extension of awareness and power, considering whether it is appropriate to make a given community or population more vulnerable by creating new forms of data or through secondary uses of data. Considerations need to be taken in that regard. This consideration might involve spending time virtually or physically in a community to understand their norms, collaborating with a community to serve their needs, or speaking to gatekeepers to understand specific harms. For example, amplifying content beyond its intended audience. This is exactly what an ethnographer would do with a research community. Trying to understand norms, build community, try and understand specific harms that a community was vulnerable to. And pervasive data research should emphasize the standard drawn from political representation movements and disability activism to do nothing about us without us. Using pervasive data to study populations without significant representation from these groups risks erasing the standpoints and lived experiences of the people behind that data. And just as in ethnography, there is a significant argument here for studying people with significant social or political power, legislators, technology companies, architects of the financial systems, for whom public accountability is important, so that data research is articulated with governance practices and how it serves power. Of course, determining one's power relative to research subjects is a complex process, and we realize that asking such reflections of researchers is a pretty big ask. However, there are numerous helpful frameworks for thinking through issues of power adapted specifically for diverse and varied forms of digital data research, including feminism, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and queer theory. And we'd love to talk about what some of these resources are. These frameworks, these theoretical frameworks, can provide concrete guidance to researchers for considering how their protocols might unevenly subject participants to increased vulnerability. So going forward, asking these questions of your data, your analysis, and your outputs is a crucial step towards addressing the ethical implications of social data research. But it can't just be the researchers themselves who are asking these questions. Review committees, referees, professional organizations can all incorporate these lines of inquiry into how they assess the ethical implications of data research. Digital device users are already quite vulnerable as their traces are turned into data by researchers, corporations, and governments. Our hope is that pervasive data research, social data research, will embrace reflections on how to decrease this vulnerability and will hold each other to higher ethical standards, particularly with respect to openness, with respect to creating openness with research subjects and building reflexivity around researchers' power and impact. Reflections on awareness and power are not required necessarily by institutional regulatory structures like IRBs, institutional review boards. IRBs were erected coming out of the Belmont report and don't necessarily reflect the kinds of tensions we were talking about earlier. Within ethnographic research, such reflections on awareness of power have become bound up with the definitions and norms of what makes for good ethical research, good practices, and good methods and good practice. Individual researchers and professional organizations that support pervasive data research can contribute to a more trustworthy research community by lifting up these norms and creating a community of practice around what constitutes good methods and good practices that incorporate awareness and power. So we hope that researchers will themselves lead reflection on awareness and power with their students and collaborators, that journals and conference reviewers will look for these reflections in the method sections of papers. And we also hope that professional organizations will foster and explicitly establish professional norms and codes for trustworthy, pervasive social data research, just as anthropologists and sociologists have done. They've done this in awareness of the limitations of the IRB for their own methods and have had to build this disciplinarily and institutionally themselves. So whether pervasive data research ultimately can gain participants' trust is not entirely up to researchers. It is a dyadic interaction, it's a two-way street. What is up to us, though, is trustworthy practice. The datafication of human activities for new knowledge creation has always demanded increased attention to the questions of awareness and justice. Pervasive data research is simply the latest practice in which we need to define what exactly responsible practices look like. So we'll end here with a link to our project websites and our email addresses in case you'd like to follow up. And I think we'd both love to take questions.
All right, hopefully you heard some of that applause from our folks in the room here.
I missed it. Can we hear it again?
Oh, that was great. Thank you. Any questions from folks in the room? I have one while we're getting started here. In your quadrant that you had, I think you had, what was it? Intentional and public was sort of one of those quadrants. Yeah, thank you. So, so broadcasts and intentional public in that region. Is, what occurred to me when I was thinking about things in that space is that, speech is often competitive. Who can be, the most liberal or the most conservative or something like that. And so I kind of imagine that depending on where you are in here, there are different biases that may present themselves in how people are exposing their data. Is that true? It seems clear to me in the intentional and public space. Are there other ones in say, the secret or the espionage or exhaust where there are biases based on how the data are collected and how the data are provided by folks?
Oh, I love this question so much. Yes, yes, definitely. Manny, do you want to talk about? So there are some really, my favorite example of this is the SMART scale, right? So this is this comes from Matt Beets, who's one of the PERVADE researchers. And so, a SMART scale is an example of espionage, probably, maybe secrets, depending on how aware you are that your scale is smart, right? So maybe that you're creating a record with that scale because you're watching it on your phone, you have some access to your data. So maybe it's a secret, right? But you're not intending to broadcast that to the world. But smart scales only measure up to a certain weight. And that's it. And that is not the full population, right? So there's only a certain group of people who can use a smart scale, meaning that any research done with that data is leaving out a whole group of people. Of course, this is true about particular digital, smart home devices and things like that, where, people with smart fridges are a small segment of the population and with certain socioeconomic characteristics. So yes, so those kinds of biases are often built into the devices that are doing data collection. That's, I think, one sort of first line set of bias that gets built in as well. Who has those devices, right? And who can use them?
That's great. Thank you. Questions from folks in the audience or anything on Q&A? Yeah. I'm just curious,
Oh, Nicoletta, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Maybe.
Yes.
Better.
That's
Okay.
great.
So I was just saying that maybe I'm a user of different social media platforms, and I know some of my information goes out, but I don't know exactly how much, and I don't have the time to control how much. I don't know how to control it sometimes. So I feel sometimes that I'm lost in this, how much I share and how much I don't. I don't know, like moving forward for a regular social media platform user, like, shall I just leave the platform? Shall I just continue to use it on my own risk? It's just, I'm always contemplating these issues, but I don't have an answer. Please, I don't.
I think what you point to is that it's very hard for users of platforms to know exactly which bucket their own data falls into. This heuristic is not necessarily going to solve all the problems platform users have to understand what their settings should be on their phone. And I would say get off of all of the platforms, but that's just me. You don't need them.
Right.
I
Maybe that's not true, right?
enjoy using them too. Like maybe
Yeah,
you do,
well,
maybe you do
and
need
there's
them.
social
Yeah, exactly.
benefits to using them, right?
Exactly.
And so this is, we are punished through data collection for the benefits we get. Like, yeah. So Manny, I'll let you finish, but then I have big feelings on this question.
Exactly. So because the things that researchers are interested in is the kind of data that's generated through using these platforms, often about very important social practices that are very live issues in people's lives. Like I use Instagram not just to like look at pretty photos, but also to like build up my identity, to stay in touch with friends, to my brothers are musicians. They use it to promote their entire livelihood. They can't not be on Instagram. I don't want to not be on Instagram. But for a researcher who's interested in using that data, it's incumbent upon them, because of the power dynamic they have, to see all of this data and the relative lack of power on users' part to know what all of these settings are, to really try and understand where the data they're using comes from, which bucket that comes in, and to try and map their research subjects' understandings of their interactions with the platform into one of those buckets. Do the people I'm producing knowledge with, do the research participants, do they think of this data as secret? If they think about it as secret, should I treat it differently than if they think about it as a broadcast? And I think that's where this heuristic is most useful, is as a prompt to try and understand what the most trustworthy way to conduct that research is, given how I understand participants, platform users' own understandings of this data.
Yeah, I mean, how did we get in a situation where your data could end up in research because you weren't careful enough, right? Like that shouldn't be the metric, right? Like you shouldn't have to think about being super careful so that your data doesn't get caught up by researchers, but also so your data doesn't get, caught up by immigration or the police, or, I bet that is not the situation right now, but individual responsibility is not going to solve this problem, right? Structural change is going to solve this problem. Legislation is going to solve this problem. We can't change, well, at least I can't change, what Facebook is doing with that data and whether it's selling it to the government. But who I can talk to is researchers, right? And so that's really, like we need to change how we think about doing research with this data and ask ourselves, how optional was that person's participation online, right? If they are a musician, you're studying musicians on Instagram, their publicness is kind of non-optional, right, for their career. And I think you should take that into consideration, as opposed to, somebody like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of an optional, like a purely optional use of social media. It's iffy. I'm not coming up with a good example, but people have different abilities to opt out, and we should take that into account when we're using this data. There's also biases in who chooses to opt out, right? So back to Dave's question.
Here we have an in-person question.
Awesome. Hi, my name is Mike. And just to extend the last question and go kind of in the public policy realm, but does your research have any implications to public policy surrounding terms of service and like what what we agreed to, everyone hits the check mark when they first sign up for the app. Any implications to regulations pertaining to that to maybe improve, what users are consenting to in their knowledge and what the last question touched on.
Yeah, really good question. So one of the, I think, hardest challenges for the platforms that sort of collect so much of this data right now is whether and how to partner with researchers. I mean, one of the things that we worry about, working in the data ethics area is something that we're seeing, which is that platforms are getting more and more nervous about partnering with researchers because of ethics issues. Facebook very famously would like to partner with researchers, keeps trying to partner with researchers, keeps not going well. And it's because it's hard, not because, there's a lot we could say about Facebook, but on this issue, I think they are really trying very, very hard to share data with researchers. And it's hard to do it well. It's hard to make sure researchers have everything they need. It's hard to make sure it's really all anonymized and private. So, and it's hard to make sure Facebook users understand that this is something that's happening with their data, right? And so, what does that look like for Facebook to negotiate with its already distrustful user base? The fact that researchers do want, for instance, data about bots during the elections and how people ended up voting and whether they saw more or less misinformation. That's all stuff we need to know. So it's we never want to say this kind of research shouldn't be done, but we do need to figure out ways to do it in ways that that don't upset users, that are trustworthy. So as far as terms of service, I don't think terms of service will ever be the place to solve this because we know that users don't read them for good reason. But there could be other ways, and things we've talked actually to Facebook in the past about is, could there be a place where you enroll in research at Facebook, right? So not everybody's incorporated. Of course, you get questions of bias, but the people who are willing to be part of Facebook research, or can people be notified when their data is going into a study and what the study's about? Can they get the study results back, right? And see what happened in that study. So I think there are ways to do this. Probably not in terms of service.
Well,
Go ahead, sorry. I was just going to add to say that it's also it's also an additional shade of gray when you consider all of the research the platforms are doing on ways using data to develop ways to improve the product that might look very much like the kind of social research that social data research that we're talking about. And there are very, very few or no limitations on what that kind of product improvement research can consist of, even if the methodology and the use of data can look the same as something that would be conducted for social data research purposes that might inform policymakers or the public about how to better protect their data or their own lives with respect to the platform. So that's a very fraught tension that also needs to be worked out alongside binning properly data for research purposes.
Thank you. We have one more in person.
Yeah, great talk. Thanks. When you're looking at public data, that things that you would be able to get access to without any passwords, just maybe web scraping or the like, and you don't have people who are opting out specifically from research, how would taking that into account look? Like, what would the researchers' actionable plan look like for that?
Yeah, good question. So I think it varies case to case, which is, always never a satisfying answer. It depends, but I'll give you an example, something I've done in my own research that maybe is helpful, because you mentioned web scraping. So I was studying mobile app developers and how they talk about privacy. And there are these wonderful online forums where mobile app developers turn to ask each other questions, one's for Apple, one's for Google developers, or Android developers. And they go, and they're there in a professional capacity. These are public sites. You don't need a password to look at them. You can search them for privacy and see all of these conversations about that developers are having with each other. So my IRB said, yeah, no problem, right? That's public data, and that's true. But I also I felt like these are not folks who were expecting to be studied, right? Like they're just going about their days building their apps, and yet there's no good way to contact them all and enroll them all in my study. They use handles that are pseudonymous, that often are associated with a business name, for instance. So what I did is I just tried to broadcast my presence there as much as possible. I posted in those forums and said, I'm a researcher. I think this is a really interesting conversation. Here's my paper if you'd like to go see it. And then I also tried to disguise the data itself when I put it into paper. So I didn't use exact quotes. I changed the quotes so they weren't Googleable or not easily Googleable. That can be a really difficult process actually to change quotes so they're not Googleable. But we tried to get them as retain the meaning while changing the wording, change people's pseudonyms so that they were not matching their direct, already pseudonymous participation online. And people who have studied Reddit, there's tons of people who study Reddit. Reddit is a huge another model organism, and people do similar things where they post in the sub forum or this and say, hey, here's the paper we wrote about this community, what do you guys think? Or here's what we're thinking about writing about this community, what do you think? And often you don't get any response, but if you do, it could be an interesting conversation.
And that's all about building trust with the community that you're researching. So even if you're scraping some publicly available data, you can make there may be ways of making your presence known. If there's not, then it's incumbent to think about what that research is being used for, what kind of risks are being produced, and doing all of the kind of consequence scanning that you might do. You might also be able to incorporate some of the participant checking. So if I don't know where you might be scraping, let's say it's from a Reddit board, you might be able to find somebody who's not in the data set, but who is a fairly vested member of that community or several people who you can involve in the research project and who can who can enter into a discourse with you to help you understand what the particular risks of a community might be. And then you have a much more intimate relationship with that population as well that might inform your findings additionally. And
one more thing here that goes back to thinking of questions of power and why that's important in this situation is that, if you were studying people who are promoting violence online, for instance, using public comments, it might actually be dangerous for you to make yourself known. And that it may still be okay to study people promoting violence because we need accountability. Once a group has gone from political organizing to advocating for violence, there's a good argument to be made that studying them with whatever data is available is appropriate, and protecting yourself as a researcher. That's where those power questions come in, because violence is a kind of power. And so, thinking about, a broad spectrum of, there are many communities would be very friendly to your participation, and there are some that aren't, right? And that's also okay. It doesn't mean we can't study those communities using pervasive data or social data. It just means we need to reflect in our papers about why we chose not to be public with our identities on those sites.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, there's still more questions well, this is great that there's more questions in Q&A and in the room, but we've reached our limit for today. So let's go ahead and thank our speakers again. So much better than the little clap icons on Zoom. And thank you very much for your time today. And we will see you next week.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Have
What
a
a
wonderful
pleasure.
day.
Take good care. Bye-bye.